Welcome everyone, and in the spirit of this webinar today, kia ora. Also in the spirit of reconciliation, myself being based in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and pay this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. Really excited to have you on board today. It's day 2 of New Zealand Wine Week. I'm also really excited with the panel that we've brought together today, because we are going to be doing a deep dive into emerging varieties and trends and change in the New Zealand wine industry. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Andrew. I am the WSET Business Development Manager for Australia and New Zealand, WSET Certified Educator and an ETP Facilitator. Without further ado, I really would like to get started by introducing you to our panel today, because it's all about them, their expertise and their knowledge. So let's get started. Firstly, I'd like to introduce, left on my screen is Jane Skilton, Master of Wine. Jane began her career in London, completing the WSET Diploma in Wines and Spirits in 1988. She then transitioned to 1993, in which she very successfully completed her MW studies. And in 2000, the lure of New Zealand brought her and her family to the lovely landscape. 2006, she founded the New Zealand School of Wine and Spirits, and since then has been teaching WSET qualifications to trade and consumers. Most of her time is spent delivering WSET courses around New Zealand. She also travels internationally to teach. Jane enjoys judging wine competitions and has been a guest at international judging at a number of Chinese and Australian wine shows. Jane is the New Zealand editor of Gourmet Traveller Wine, contributes to a number of other wine publications in both New Zealand and overseas. Welcome, Jane, and thank you for giving up your time today.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Next on my screen, we have Celia Hay. So Celia is the director of the New Zealand School of Food and Wine. Celia has been educating the next generation of wine, hospitality and culinary professionals since founding the school in 1995. Celia holds both an MBA and a Masters of Education. Her focus is on creating education programs that are approved by New Zealand Qualifications Authority. She has recently been appointed the Wine and Beverage Lecturer at Auckland University of Technology in a part-time capacity. Welcome, Celia. It's great to see you again. And our final panelist for today is Michael Darby. So Michael started his career actually in Australia as a marketer and product manager in the breakfast, cereal and health food industry. He returned to New Zealand to take up a role as a lecturer, first at the Christchurch College of Education, followed by the University of Canterbury. Out of curiosity, in 2019, he completed his first vintage as a cellar hand in North Canterbury between teaching obligations. He started the Third Man Wines, specialising in Riesling, and then more recently started producing Small Theory as a hobby project, producing small batch wines. Michael is a certified sommelier with CMS, 2 years experience as consulting and practicing sommelier. He's a WSET diploma graduate 2017 and current MW student. Alongside all of this, teaching WSET level 1 to 3 through the Wine Education Company, which he launched in 2018. He's currently teaching marketing at Nelson Marlborough Institute of Technology today. So as you can see, we've got an amazing wealth of talent, expertise and knowledge in the New Zealand landscape. It is great to have 3 approved providers, the 3 business owners and founders of their APPs. And we're going to get started with the first discussion of focusing from Michael and his knowledge and expertise on change in the New Zealand landscape. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a little correction. It's actually 2008 that I did my first cellar hand vintage, which was a good reason never to go out too late at night. Otherwise, you get roped into doing crazy things. But crazy things is what, of course, this is all about sometimes. I came into the industry at a time of change, which is 2008, 2009. And if we look at the last 10 years, you know, we think about what's gone on in the New Zealand industry in the last 10 years, it's been really quite incremental. Like if you were to look at it on the headline, the industry's doubled in size, which is no mean feat. And yet it's been kind of punctuated by 2 extremely transformational events. And the first was when I was in the industry, and it wasn't me getting into the industry, it was the fact that we had an oversupply problem. So we had this enormous oversupply at a time of falling demand due to the GFC. And it's kind of interesting now today to look back, because it took a good 5 years really for the industry to bounce back from that. And it to some degree, it still casts a shadow of the industry in terms of, you know, the expected pricing of Sauvignon Blanc, which is much lower now. It actually hasn't really changed for 10 years than you know, pre-2008 levels. And so it's doubled, but yet what's really happened in 10 years? It's been this process of incremental change and consolidation. And we can bookend this with today's kind of COVID pandemic with an undersupply. Melba, of course, been down about 21% in the 2021 vintage, and the national harvest been down about 19%. So we've kind of got this bookend of two punctuating events that I think will define the industry for some time, followed by kind of a doubling of the size of the industry in between. So we've definitely had an interesting ride, and I think the last 10 years have been not spectacular in terms of transformation. We haven't had the arrival of Sauvignon Blanc. We haven't had the arrival of screw caps. There hasn't been any one thing that's really defined the industry, but we have had probably 1,000 incremental changes, which kind of describe the industry and has led its growth. So in the last 10 years, what would I have thought? You know, like let's consider it in terms of change. Now, change in the industry is, I kind of see it as a little bit more of a conversation or process of discovery. And it's a conversation between producers and consumers. And 10 years ago, you know, this oversupply caused a lot of hurt in vineyards, a lot of hurt to vineyard owners. The price of wine went down. The winners in this were the consumers. The losers of this largely were people that owned vineyards and those that were undercapitalized. So there was a lot of hurt that went into it. And if we fast forward to today, I think we have a kind of a similar problem. There will be people that are in fact find it difficult going through this change process. Nonetheless, if you were to have this hypothesis 10 years ago, the hypothesis would have been Sauvignon Blanc was potentially the reliance on Sauvignon Blanc was a massive industry for the massive issue for the New Zealand industry. We were vulnerable. Perhaps people would consider it to be fragile. That hasn't panned out. The last 10 years has definitely shown that Sauvignon Blanc continues to grow and continues to improve in its quality and its ability to deliver really what the customer wants, which is at a range of price levels, exceptionally high quality, protective wines, and wines that are fruit forward and refreshing. If we were to have a look at Pinot Noir 10 years ago, we would have thought that this would have perhaps gone forward in terms of being the second Sauvignon Blanc. We might consider that to be the star of the next 10 years. I think Pinot Noir has definitely improved in terms of its quality and its accolades. We could discuss whether that is producer-driven or consumer-driven, but Pinot Noir has definitely developed in terms of its style. Perhaps its commercial success has not been what we anticipated. And I think a similar kind of thing is true of Chardonnay. We would have anticipated more commercial success. Instead, what we've had is accolades and, you could say, great quality across the board. Kimberly, we had a poll. I just wanted to quickly run the first poll. Just want to see where we're at, if in terms of where you're currently studying or your highest level. Just want to quickly see. What our highest level is. Okay, can we close the poll off? Okay, 28% diploma, 33% level 3, 30% level 2. Okay, 8% level 1. That's great. I meant to do that first, so it's good to know where we're at. So in terms of change, you know, I think what we're going to see in this current change, and I think maybe Jane's going to speak heavily on this, but or with more insight on this, but we're going to see prices going up because of the undersupply, and we're going to see bulk producers and those that rely on cheaper Sauvignon Blanc perhaps losing out of this. If we were to just quickly jump onto some trends in the industry, it's kind of a little bit like an elephant metaphor, that proverbial elephant where the blind people stand around and try and describe the elephant. The New Zealand industry is so broad, so distinctive, so I guess so diverse in terms of its styles. We don't have a strong kind of GI system that directs winemakers in terms of what they're to make. But we do see some trends. And the first one we're going to just quickly talk about is rosé. And this is a global trend. In New Zealand, this has gone forward, become a growing category, mostly on the domestic market, but a dry fruity style of rosé. So that's probably the key trend of the last few years, which is a rise in rosé. A few interesting ones that I thought I'd mention while we're talking about rosé. And can we have a bit of a poll? The next poll, please, Kimberly. Okay, the rosé stand, we're not talking about sustainable from an environmental point of view, but is it sustainable in terms of, could it grow? Could it double in size? The New Zealand rosé industry. Okay, let's close that. Okay, people think yes, rosé could double in size, or can definitely continue the growth. And let's have a look at one more poll, the next poll for rosé. Is it primarily driven by the consumer or the producer? Now there's no right answer to this, but it's a great discussion point. Okay, what have we got? Okay, so 76% saying consumer. Yeah, there are examples of this. So a lot of the New Zealand producers are actually making rosé often as a cash flow wine from really high quality Pinot Noir. So the costs are high. That's not really I don't think that's necessarily a sustainable rate to grow. A couple of examples is Dave Closton from Two Rivers, doing more or less a Southern French style and actually planting for rosé, which is a different point of view. I think that's a producer driven kind of trend, and I do see that continuing. But there's at the opposite end of the market, there is definitely a consumer driven aspect. If you consider, say, that Gießen make a blush from a Riesling, and this Riesling is the second I guess by volume, so the second highest selling Riesling in New Zealand is actually a rosé, and that's really a consumer driven wine, in the sense that it's ideal for a millennial market. It's an occasion wine. It could be put in keg. It can be over the summer, I guess 3 bottles into my house, and so it's kind of got this broad drinkability over the summer. So a really good barbecue occasion type of wine, and I see that as a good use of Riesling in New Zealand, which has really struggled, but definitely a consumer driven. If we just have a look at sparkling for a minute, let's have the first poll for sparkling. Actually, no, just hold off. We'll just hold off on that. Actually, no, let's keep going. Do that poll now. We'll talk about Petnat first. Is
Michael,
Petnat?
If I could just interrupt there, while that poll can continue while we're talking. So Kimberly, feel free to have that poll up. I just think really poignant comments about rosé, and I love your polls on whether it's consumer led or producer led. Through my MW studies, I ended up with a visit to Ernst & Gallo, and this was in 2019. At the time, they were planning to build bottling facilities in Europe ahead of the rise of the demand of rosé. So if that says something from a financial commitment, it may be consumer led, but producers that have the ability to support it definitely are ahead of the game. Back to you.
Yeah, I think like it's always a whether something's consumer or producer led is a little bit of a judgment call, but I think it makes a great discussion, because I think definitely like the Two Rivers example that I'll debut or beauty now is one that is paler, more savory than the fruit forward versions from New Zealand. And I think that's visionary, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's definitely, like, these things work hand in hand. On the other hand, it's really good to have something that's more kind of drinkable for millennials and those entering the wine market. In this case, the Riesling with a touch of Syrah. So if we think about sparkling, again, this is not a New Zealand trend. This is a global trend. Sparkling is up dramatically in the last 5 years, and it's proliferating. It's not just specialty producers anymore. It's proliferating across a range of producers. So those that typically produce still wines. In addition to that, we see Mumm entering Marlborough with the Mumm Marlborough, and I think we definitely see that as a trend. I think something kind of emerging in this trend is in the pet nat space. A wine that perhaps we could talk about as a conversation is the Greystone Riesling pet nat, because Riesling, as I said, has slightly struggled to gain a foothold commercially as a kind of a recognised commercial wine in many places in New Zealand, and that the pet nat that goes there is not just going into specialty channels; it's really going into traditional liquor channels, and so, for those of you that said yes, pet nat can cross the boundaries, I think we're definitely seeing pet nat crossing the boundaries. If we can have the next poll. Oh, okay. So I guess I've got a different question to that, actually, which is pet nat, what would have to happen for pet nat to cross over into mainstream polls? We'll keep that poll up for a minute. What would have to happen for pet nat to go really mainstream? And I think that is what's on a lot of producers' mind in New Zealand, which is how do we do this at scale? What technology would we need? What steps forward in our knowledge would we need in order to for pet nat to be mainstream? We can't really talk about emerging trends without talking about natural wines and low intervention. The natural wine movement still is proudly, I think, and very well represented by specialist producers such as Candeli, but also mainstream producers are starting to either make a natural or low-fi alternative wine. Usually organic producers do that, such as Carrick with with some of their wines. But I think across the board, low intervention or lo-fi ideas are infiltrating more standard commercial wines, which may not quite hit grocery, but they'll hit traditional liquor. Ones that are unfined, unfiltered, ambient yeast, low SO2, wines that may be a bit cloudy, can go out into an increasing number of outlets. As I said, not typically grocery, but others. I think an interesting point is Paquette, and there's a few of those starting to be made, and I think that's a wine, a beverage, a wine-based beverage that will kind of appeal to sustainable consumers and millennials. Finally, I think just it's worth also noting that bulk. Will low intervention wines carry over into mainstream channels? That's 70%. That's good. I don't have an answer to that, of course. So it's really good to see the feedback there. And is there one more poll? I think. Kimberly, yeah. Okay, are low intervention wines scalable? And I think this is kind of related also to the pet nat question. Okay, what have we got there? Yeah, 50-50.
Yes, I think it's too early at this stage for this category to really have an understanding of where it's heading. But it's certainly, Michael, really encouraging to see that is, low intervention here to stay, and that those that are on this webinar have suggested yes. But obviously there is a high percentage of alumni that come with a very considered background, but certainly it's very encouraging.
And I think if we go back to the beginning, where we see a wine industry that is punctuated by transformation, but developed over a long period of time with the less seen innovations and the kind of the trends that are under the surface, the unseen trends, we might see natural wines cross over with perhaps 1,000 small moves rather than any large move.
Absolutely. Now, look, I'm very mindful of time. I'm very mindful that I didn't apologise at the beginning of this webinar. I've had some technical issues and I'm having to do this from my phone, which means my visibility is negligible for the chat, but do keep the chat going. Kimberly, my colleague in the background, she will be monitoring Q&A, and what we might do, Kimberly, is if you're happy to pull out the pertinent questions to have at the end, because we've got a 15-minute allocation for questions and answers at the end. And for those of you that are using the Q&A chat function, if your question is not addressed during this webinar, we will continue behind the scenes and we will continue to answer your questions and get back to you. And obviously this will ultimately be converted to a podcast that you'll be able to see again. Michael, was there any final comments you wanted to make before we move on to the next panelist?
Well, I think just one little final tension, and that is bulk exports have risen strongly over past years, with the last 3 or 4 years, with private label. And there's this real interesting discussion around does labeling, also does bottling in market improve what the winemaker intended to deliver, or has the winemaker lost control? And there's definitely been a trend towards saying, there's definitely arguments and a trend towards the bottling in market that says, hey, the winemaker can put in a bottle what they expected to put in a bottle by making sure all the stats, all the dimensions, or it is correct before bottling. It's the counter to that, it's kind of an argument that we had about screw caps. The same kind of argument is what in the bottle what the winemaker intended to put in the bottle. Screw cap versus cork, and it's just interesting. There's a counter to that in Appellation Marlborough, because Marlborough is obviously the region that has the most bulk exports, and Appellation Marlborough I think is a really interesting development where they said no, it must be bottled in region. We're going to control yields, and it's a model that's got a lot of momentum very quickly, and I kind of think that maybe the other regions will pay attention and do something similar. That's my last comment.
Yeah, no, look, that's great observations. Thank you so much, Michael. We will now move over to Celia. I know Celia has a presentation that she's going to share. So Celia, if you're happy to start getting that up onto the screen, we're going to be moving into sustainability and wine growing, which it would be very fair to say that New Zealand are global leaders in this space in terms of viticulture and indeed vinification. So without further ado, I will hand over to Celia, mindful that we're pushing against the clock on time. Thanks, Celia.
Okay, kia ora and welcome everybody. I'm trying to make this, go to my full screen, but it's not, I'm not in the right place. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit. I thought I'd just show you some slides. So can everybody see that? Okay, vineyard shot.
Screen now.
All right. Okay, so what I was tasked to discuss was about, what's the next grape that's going to, hit the shelves around the world and export markets and so forth. But I thought I would just, in discussing this question, I really wanted to just give you some background into where we really are at. And Michael's already mentioned that we've had a small, 2021 was around 20% lower production in New Zealand. But across the board, generally, Sauvignon Blanc remains still about 72% of our production. And you'll see that there's a big drop to the next grape variety, which is Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is only 6% of wine production. Pinot Noir is around 6% as well. And, the next grape is Pinot Gris at, 5.5%. So we've got this huge gap between what we're producing. And so therefore that also percolates through to what we can actually export. And you'll see I've put the grape Syrah, which has been, sort of an up and coming grape in the last 10 years. you can see it's only at less, 0.7% of the production. So again, very small. And again, just to remind you that New Zealand is still only considered about 1% of global production. So how does this work? And we can think of New Zealand as having around 40,000 hectares of plants, which equates to Provence, for instance. And of that, Sauvignon Blanc is definitely the king at 62%. Pinot Noir is in at 14%. Chardonnay at 8% of plantings. And here again is Syrah, just to give you an indication that it's only 1%. And so if I'm looking at grape varieties that I would want to try and favor, and Viognier is one of them, you can see that the plantings are not even 1%. So how can we get growth in international markets when we are still so focused on Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc? But then the next question is, why would we choose to change that? So I just again wanted to remind you of, I should move that down there, sorry. You can see in terms of our wine regions, again, Marlborough is significantly bigger. It's significantly bigger, 28,000 hectares, Hawke's Bay, 4,500, Central Otago, 2,000, North Canterbury, nearly 1,500. Then we have Gisborne, Nelson and the Wairarapa, just over 1,000 hectares. And Auckland, where I'm sitting today, 289 hectares. Northland, the top of the country, 74. And the small wine region of Waitaki is only 65 hectares. So we're still very much reliant on Marlborough as the leading region. And then if we look at what we have seen happen, though, is this whole growth in organics. And when you look, organics, biodynamics, but what New Zealand wine growers have done since 1995 is they have had the specific focus on sustainability, and it has become a policy for new wineries who are setting up that it's built this culture of sustainability within New Zealand. And if you can, this is coming from the New Zealand Wine Growers Annual Report, you'll see it says here 96% of New Zealand vineyards are certified as sustainable wine growing. And that means that they do have an audit every 3 years. They're looking at how they're managing their resources within the vineyard. And it has these goals. Goals you'll see are for water, being a world leader in efficient water use. Others goals of waste. New Zealand wine industry wants to achieve zero waste to landfill by 2050. Pests and diseases, understanding, reducing and mitigating the impacts of existing potential pests and diseases, and being a world leader in sustainable alternatives. And then in recent years, there has been this move to focus on climate change. This is a New Zealand government-led initiative, and the New Zealand wine industry, its focus as well is to become carbon neutral by 2050. So obviously we want to focus on our people, and then of course the soil is another of these goals. And some of you might recognize this little logo on the left. This is the logo of sustainable wine growing, and it is often, well, you should see it on the bottles in the markets where you are, because it signals to you that that vineyard is part of this program. And we have, other organisations in New Zealand. There are 2 organisations who certify for organics. This first one here is called Assure Quality. The second one is called BioGrow, and they both have organic certification. So again, in export markets, you will see if it's BioGrow, it will have this little logo on the bottle. And then with Demeter is the certification for biodynamics. In New Zealand, there are only a handful of vineyards that are certified these days, but we do have over 200 certified organic vineyards. And what everybody's talking about is what is happening with our greenhouse gases. What is happening, how much is a vineyard through its own activities, how much is it contributing to the greenhouse gas emission for New Zealand? And this diagram is coming from a sustainable wine growing publication. It's looking at the different aspects of getting a bottle of wine to market, from packaging, distribution, vineyard, and winery costs. And you can see in this smaller circle, you can see some of the direct costs for vineyards, also including sprays, the use of fertilizers, what you're doing with harvesting methods, how you're managing frosts. Bird management, you might think that's quite a curious thing, but that's really to do with all the birds trying to feast on those ripe grapevines. And so this, we're talking about, how sustainable is New Zealand wine. And we obviously are a country whose economy is driven by export. And so, the wine sector in 1990 had around, under $20 million worth of exports. But by, 2020, 2021, it's now $2 billion. So this is an extraordinary growth, an extraordinary success story of exports. And of course, it is on the back of the Sauvignon Blanc market. So people are looking at these emissions, how much carbon is generated through export, how can we manage it better in the vineyard and within our own small worlds. And, it's getting complicated. Sorry, was that Sarah?
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, okay. I'm really sorry to interrupt. I'm following my session plan to the minute as a good WSET educator, and we're literally coming into our last 15 minutes. So I might have to get you to jump through to any of your top key slides.
Okay, well, I'll just go through and just here's, this is coming through government. But also what I do want to say to you is that if you're finding it difficult to find some of these unusual grape varieties, and they are there, you're going to have to come to New Zealand. And we're going to open, hopefully, in October, so you will be able to come. But, if you want to try some unusual grape varieties, if you want to go to Milton and get that Chenin Blanc, then you should go and visit them in their vineyard. But also, I just want to introduce you to this slide, and I'll wrap it up here, Sarah. This is a list, if you were coming to New Zealand, I'd be looking at some of these organic wineries and looking at how their wine tourism operations, how you can go and visit them, especially if you look at here from Canterbury, that you can fly into Christchurch and go up to Marlborough, or drive, hire a car and drive down. You can, from Canterbury, we've got 40 minutes on the North Canterbury vineyards are 40 minutes from the city. So there's a whole list of things to do, but it's going to be hard to find these emerging grape varieties in your own markets because they're primarily not exported. So I've got a link in here for New Zealand wine growers. So for those of you who are interested, you should definitely follow them on Instagram. They're very proactive. They've got lots of great things that are there. So I'm wrapping that up, Sarah.
Thank you, Celia. I might ask you to put that link into the chat as we move over to Jane. But what I will say, because there have been quite a few questions on seeing this again and content, we do have the events hub that's now been launched with WSET. It's a new program of global events, and all of these webinars make it onto YouTube. In addition, as I said, questions that have not been answered because we've run out of time will be answered, and our panel have very kindly acknowledged that if there are pertinent questions directed to them, my colleague Kimberly will be able to forward those, and you will get responses to your questions. So handing over to Jane now. We're literally really keen to look into challenges and opportunities for New Zealand moving forward, domestic versus export, and there have been a few questions on the no and low category, so no and low alcohol, in which New Zealand is very much stepping into this space. So Jane, let's have a chat.
Definitely. Good morning, everyone. I had to laugh to begin with because I thought, well, this is a classic new world question, isn't it? What would you do going forward, or how do you see change or new grape varieties? And I thought, well, we wouldn't be sitting here having a seminar with Bordeaux, would we? And asking them, well, do you think people are sick of Cabernet Sauvignon? What are you going to plant going forward? And I think we have to acknowledge that we're world leaders in and great at producing Sauvignon Blanc. So anything we see, because most of our production goes offshore, so I think it's 80% of all the wines we make go offshore. I think any producer that decides to really go long on something different is going to have to acknowledge that that's quite a difficult space to be in. You're going to be one ferment in a sea of other wines overseas. So I can't really see that there won't be very much. Personally, I don't see any movement. I'm old enough to remember my first bottle of Marlborough Sauvignon back in, well, I won't say because it will date me entirely, but we imported Cloudy Bay, and still people are drinking the wine, still people love it, still people want Marlborough Sauvignon, or New Zealand Sauvignon, should I say. So I think that we have to acknowledge that I don't think the marketplace is going to change anytime soon, to be honest with you. So people can play around the edges, but I think that that's what we're really good at. I think that COVID has caused a reset, most definitely. And I think we should look on it as a positive, because I think there's obviously, if you look at from our little isolation down here in the South Pacific, you look at Europe and you see there's the sort of same things happen every year. So there's Provine, or there's Vinexpo, or there's the London Wine Trade Fair, and there's a sort of the New Zealand tasting in London, or what have you, tastings in China. And there's this almost a sort of this is the start of the year, this is what we'll do. And without the ability to travel, and obviously New Zealand has been severely hit by closed borders. So none of us have traveled anywhere. I was trying to explain it to somebody in Italy the other day, and they couldn't still believe that we can't travel, but that's why we're safe down here. But I think it's caused us to think, well, what can we do? How can we do things differently? How can we reach people? How can we do other things? So what are the problems for us here in New Zealand would have been getting in workers. So seasonal workers, we're very focused on agriculture. So we're competition from things like kiwi fruits, orchard fruits, what have you. So it will be almost unheard of to go to a restaurant or a bar or a winery and not be amazed by the number of people from overseas working there. It's a classic, people are interested, they come down here, they do lots of different jobs, they travel about. And that's been a real benefit, I think, to the New Zealand wine industry, to see the, young people from different parts of the world, super interested, bringing, they might have done a vintage in their own country or overseas. And we've kind of lost that through no fault of our own. They just can't come here. So I think there's a real problem. The New Zealand wine growers have campaigned strongly to get some sort of recognition of the fact that we need these people. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have, going into our third vintage this year, up against it. So I've been contacted a number of times by wineries saying, you know, you've got lots of eager students. Do they want to come and pick grapes? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'll ask them, you know, and whatever. And I said, I should come and pick grapes. And they said, even you. And I thought, my goodness, if you're quite happy to accept somebody of my age coming in and working for you, then maybe it is slightly desperate. But I think the New Zealanders, why did I marry one? You know, why are New Zealanders so well loved? Because there's no whinging and moaning. They'll just have to get on with it. You know, we won't have enough people. We're 400 people down. But I think New Zealanders are, if one of the great things is they just roll their sleeves up. They're not, you know, this isn't my job. People just get on with things. So I think that it might have been a different mentality, maybe could have impacted in another country. I don't know. But here, I think people are just going to deal with it. We're lucky. Look at it positively. You know, Marlborough Sauvignon, a lot of it would be harvested by machine, and that works in our favor. We know from studies that if you machine harvest, you release all the precursors for thiol production, and we know that people like thiols and Sauvignon Blanc. So look at it, you know, if we were making lots of hand-picked, I don't know, Pinot Noir or something like that, it might be different, but look at it positively. You know, that's in our favor. So I think that that's good. I think packaging, things like, you know, dry goods, getting shipments out, that's a problem. There's lots of talk of shipping getting just past Sydney and then not making that last whiz across the Tasman to get to us. So I think for wineries, that seems to have been, there was terrible, even though we make some of the best sparkling wine in the world, there was a terrible rumor that we wouldn't be getting any champagne because nobody could get it here. So fortunately, we're well stocked with our own sparkling wine, but you know, there's imported wine into New Zealand and exported wine out. That would be, I think, a problem. So there has been some challenges of dealing with COVID, but as I say, strong representation from wine growers, and you know, there were stories last year of people, you know, the camper vans, which the classic for people from overseas is you fly to New Zealand, you hire a camper van, and then you tiki tour all the way around the islands, you know, in your little motorhome, seeing the country. Well, obviously with no tourists, there are no motorhome rentals, and so wineries were hiring them, and then people were staying on site. So you know, they may have had to say goodbye to their families for a certain period of time, but again, that kind of can-do attitude, I think, serves us particularly well here. So people just, I'm sure, had, you know, it was stressful, but you know, sorry, you were saying, Sarah. Sorry.
I think, Jane, it's fair to say it's that can-do attitude coupled with what I've been most impressed with by the horticultural sector and government is that during the pandemic, they looked at managed isolation and quarantine and went, we haven't got the workers, we need the workers for sustainability, so let's remanipulate that in a safe way. And as a result of doing that, you've been able to get several thousand workers from the islands in to you know, to maintain vintage and to keep moving forward. And that's something,
absolutely,
we've done really badly, but New Zealand has just gotten on and done it, which is a credit to everyone involved.
No, absolutely. And that, you know, there's been seminars on keeping people, you know, engaged and mental health, and, you know, that kind of thing is important to make sure people are looked after. And that's where, again, I think being in a relatively small industry, people, even in the good times, people tend to help each other out here. It's not that sort of, you know, I'm not going to say anything to anybody else because I want to be the best. You can be the best and still be quite generous with your time. So I think that's worked. That's worked here. What else do you want me to?
So I think, given that we're coming into our last 10 minutes, there've been a few questions on the no-low category, and obviously that's one of the 3 levy-funded programs on lighter wines. Are you able to talk a little bit in that space about what's happening in New Zealand? Because there's a huge figure in the next 10 years of about 10% of your production being in this space. So I'd like to hear some more, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm going to nail my colours to the mast here and say I don't believe there is no alcohol wine. There's a drink that was wine in a previous life and has had the alcohol taken out of it. And although I've read some very positive reviews of some of them, I personally would not choose to drink them myself, but that's just me. What the industry here has worked on are these lower alcohol wines. So not making a wine and then taking a big percentage of it out and calling it no alcohol or lower alcohol, but is to work at trying to, I mean, if anything, New Zealand's wines are just bursting with flavor, bursting with personality, bursting with all sorts of good stuff. So why not just temper the alcohol slightly? You know, we know how miserable we feel if we drink lots of wine at 14 and 14.5%. You know, a couple of glasses is fine, but that's really quite tiring to drink wine at that strength. Unless it's Fino sherry, and then that's fine, but 15% is fine. But it's not for table wine. It's not particularly helpful. And with the growing emergence of, you know, kind of alternative lifestyles or plant-based lifestyles, or people looking at, you know, it's given us all a chance to sit at home in isolation and think, you know, what can I do? And you can go two ways, can't you? You can either do the kind of tea and biscuits run, which is kind of my natural way, or you can think, no, I'm going to change. I'm going to drink less alcohol. I'm going to be healthy. I'm going to eat more plants and vegetables, and not so much meat, maybe. So here we're super lucky that we've got the Brigato Research Institute, which is down in Marlborough, and they are funded by the industry and by the government. And what they've done is looked at ways to kind of drive the quality of New Zealand wine forward. How can we harness all the amazing research that's being done? And one of them is to manipulate both in the vineyard and in the winery. So in the vineyard, you can do things like, you know, obviously we've got young soils, plenty of sunshine, plenty of water, as we find, you know, the rainfall is not a problem really here. Drought on the East Coast, but not normally. We've got more than enough water than we need. So you've got enormous verdant vines, you know, lots of leaves, lots of fruit, lots of everything. If you can manipulate that vine naturally, then you can remove leaves, you can make it deficient in irrigation. You can possibly still get the lovely flavors and the personality, but make wines that achieve lower alcohols, you know, kind of 9-10% alcohol. So you still get lots of the goodies, but you're not drinking basically flavored water. In the winery, you can use non-Saccharomyces yeasts to create aroma components, not alcohol. You can have open fermenters, try and get rid of ethanol that way. There's lots going on. There's lots of manipulation of people are practicing, you know, manipulating vine tips so that they point them, I think it's down, so that they're not sending carbohydrates out to the fruit. All these things I think are really exciting, because the wines have been judged. I read something online where apparently there was a big push in Australia, and people tasted wines in one of your large retailers, and people not only liked them, much more than, and so the rate of consumption or the rate of buy through from tasting a wine to buying the wine was higher than if they tasted normal wine. So I think people actually tasted them and thought, wow, this is actually lovely, and I can maybe have a glass of wine and be able to drive, or I'm thinking, you know, I'm looking for altering my lifestyle slightly. So I think, again, that's, you know, again, I'm sorry to say, I'm old enough to remember when non-alcoholic wine was dreadful stuff, but this is really lovely wine now. It goes into wine judging, and maybe sometimes you might just stop and think, whoa, there's probably a little bit lower alcohol in those wines. Could that be one of these, you know, lifestyle category kind of styles, these lower alcohol wines? But often they stand up really pretty well. So if you went into a supermarket here or a bottle shop, you would see a big stack. They're not sort of one or two wines which are just sort of squeezed in with everything else. There's big displays now of these. These are becoming a valid choice for people, you know, not just you know, a sort of grudging purchase if you're hungover. It's what people are actively choosing to do. So yeah, no, I think we're going to be, you know, yay, another world leader.
Well, you literally, Jane, took words out of my mouth. Like, you have been world leaders in Sauvignon Blanc, and we can't forget the fact that you still are. You are the country in the world that has not just gone from strength to strength. You have maintained that success globally, but you've got all of this exciting things under the precipice. In addition, I do believe that in that sort of no-low space, without compromise of texture and flavour and mouthfeel, you're already producing world-class wines, which is really exciting to see. That as an industry, you're taking this seriously, but there's no compromise, and it's back to the viticulture. It's back to it's not adjusting at the end. It's how do we start for the end result? I think that's what New Zealand producers have always done really well.
Well, I think, you know, the fact that there's so many people on the webinar from all around the world, wine is such an amazing, you know, the combination of what's gone before, the history, but also that amazing innovation, new things to look at, new grape varieties, new styles. That's what keeps us all interested. Surely that's, if we stand still, then there's just no point. But we're always, gosh, the questions are zooming past.
Yeah, again, as you know, as a great comment, we've had, you know, close to 200 people live here today from all around the world, from what I've seen. And again, we are literally into our last 30 seconds of this webinar, but please do continue to put your questions into Q&A. They'll be filtered back to our team in the UK. They will then be filtered out to our panel in New Zealand. The Events Hub, this will be a YouTube post, so you will get to see it again. And let's continue this discussion. And for the alumni out there, it's nice to connect. Let's do more together. On that note, I'd love to say thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to Jane, front and centre of my screen at the moment, to Celia and to Michael. Thank you to my marketing team colleagues that put this together, and to Kimberly, who's been behind the scenes today. And most importantly, thank you for those that have joined the webinar. It is just great to connect at a time that we can't travel. Stay safe, stay healthy, go well, and I'll be in contact with my panel later today. But thank you so much for your time. It's been a really wonderful morning.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you.